All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, welcome back for the second session of the ECI Fall webinar. Before we get to our session for today, I just want to introduce myself, tell you a couple of things that are upcoming at the ECI, and then we'll get to Jennifer Urban's presentation. So I'm Jennifer Rothschild. I am the director of the Educating Character Initiative. You are attending today our equipment webinar, which is where we put together resources that we think will be useful for those of you at campuses across the United States and beyond who are currently or interested in doing programming work, educating character. We also have two other webinars running, which I will mention to you briefly because we have events in those coming up. So on September 5th, there is a meeting of the Flourishing Student webinar series that is run by the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues, and we are the co-sponsors of that series. That will be an exciting session. We also are running an ECI book club webinar. We had our first meeting recently, and it was wonderful. The next meeting is on October 3rd, and we'll be discussing John Inazu's book, Learning to Disagree. So we hope to see all of you there. The series that you're here to listen to today is the theme of the fall series is how to do assessment and measurement of character in the university. Like I said, this is our second session. There are several more running throughout the fall. We're really happy to have with us today Jennifer Brown Urban. She is, let me make sure I get her title right. She is the Professor of Family Science and Human Development and the co-director of the Institute for Research on Youth Thriving and Evaluation at Montclair State University. She's absolutely the best in the business of this kind of work. She has running some exciting programs at Montclair State. She's one of our current ECI grantees, and she's doing some really interesting stuff on virtual reality. She's also been associated with a longstanding project at Arizona State University that many of you probably know about. I'll let her talk about her work and how she thinks about coming to character programming and doing assessment. So here to talk about her title is An Introduction to Program Planning and Evaluation of Character Programs. I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer Urban.
Thank you so much. And let's see, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So first I'd like to start by thanking Jennifer and the Educating Character Initiative for inviting me to speak with you today. It's really an honor and a privilege to meet all of you, even though I can't see all of you, and have the chance to share some of my expertise in character development, program planning, and evaluation. So in today's talk, I'm going to focus on how to articulate your program's approach to character development, connect what you do or what you're planning to do with the research evidence base, and develop a measurement and evaluation strategy. So you might already have an approach to program development and evaluation planning that you're using and that you like. So some of what I'm about to share with you might be familiar, whereas other aspects could be novel. So you can pick and choose what seems useful to you. Together with colleagues at Cornell University, I developed an approach to program planning and evaluation called relational systems evaluation, which is grounded in theory and was developed and refined through work with practitioners and program developers from a variety of organizations, and particularly programs that focus on character development. However, relational systems evaluation is content agnostic and can be applied to any program or initiative. Today, I'm going to be telling you about some components of RSE. So according to RSE, in order to do good program planning and evaluation, we need to work in research practice partnerships. In a true partnership model, the knowledge and the expertise of program practitioners and developers is of equal value to that of researchers or evaluators. Now, the predominant model tends to overprivilege researcher knowledge and expertise and undervalue practitioner expertise. So, to be clear, I don't have all of the answers as a researcher or an evaluator. I can't tell you what works best in your specific programs in the specific contexts and settings where you're situated with the specific populations that you work with. You, your staff, your participants hold valuable information that needs to be part of the conversation when designing, adapting, or evaluating your character initiative. As a researcher, I bring knowledge of what we know from research, and I have expertise in research methods, methodology, and developmental psychology. But I could not develop a successful program or program evaluation if I couldn't be in true partnership with the people who know the participant population and the context best. So in addition to working through research practice partnerships, we also use an evolutionary evaluation approach. Similar to people, programs are rarely static, but rather they develop and they grow at varying rates over time. And to properly understand a program and what it needs, we need to consider where the program or initiative is in its development. We define phases in the life cycles of individual programs and evaluations. So on the program side, we characterize the phases as initiation, development, stability, and dissemination. As a program moves through these phases, we tend to see stabilization of program content and approach as a program settles into its essential components. So if we break this down, a program in program lifecycle phase 1, initiation, is either relatively new or being implemented in a new context or with a new population for the first few times. This is a program that's still undergoing rapid changes or revisions. A phase 2 development program is still undergoing revisions, but the scale and the scope of those revisions is smaller. So most program elements are being implemented consistently, though some elements might still be developing. A phase 3 stability program is implemented consistently. It looks the same each time it's implemented, and variation between those delivering the program is minimal. So there's also typically a written protocol or a curriculum in place for delivering the program. Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to know whether a program is in phase 2 development or phase 3 stability. So in order to figure this out, you can use what we call the lightning bolt test. So let's imagine I'm the person who developed the program, or I've been the primary practitioner delivering the program. If tomorrow I were struck by a bolt of lightning, could the program continue on in the same way without me? Or did the program live within me? If my answer is that program died when I did, then I have a program that's still in phase 2. If it's able to survive beyond me, then I know I have a program in phase 3, stability. Finally, a program in phase 4, dissemination, is being implemented in multiple settings. Now, if we look to the evaluation side, we also divide life cycles into 4 phases: process and response, change, comparison and control, and generalizability. The evaluation life cycle definitions describe the kinds of claims one would be interested in making at that phase, as well as the corresponding methodology or design that should be employed. It's important to note that both quantitative and qualitative approaches can be used at any evaluation lifecycle phase, and a wide range of measurement approaches can be appropriate. Things like surveys, interviews, focus groups, observations, other report, analysis of artifacts, among others. The evaluation lifecycle phase definitions give a general sense of some, but not all, of the kinds of evaluation approaches or designs that are appropriate at each lifecycle phase. So if we break these down, a phase 1 process and response evaluation is primarily focusing on questions related to implementation and whether the program is being received well by the program recipients and practitioners who are delivering it. You could be developing and doing some preliminary tests on measures, and you might even start to use some post-program assessments to look for the presence or absence of some desired outcomes. Phase 2, change evaluations, are where you're starting to look at pre-post changes in outcomes. You're examining also things like measure reliability and validity. Phase 3, comparison and control evaluations, assess effectiveness using approaches such as a randomized controlled trial or quasi-experimental designs with statistical controls. And finally, phase 4, generalizability evaluations, are using approaches such as meta-analysis and multi-site trials to examine programmatic effectiveness across a range of contexts and/or populations. So when considering your character initiative, you need to determine 3 things. First, what's the program lifecycle phase of the program? Are you designing a new program or initiative, which would be phase 1? Or are you working with an already existing program or initiative that's in a later lifecycle phase? Second, you need to consider your prior evaluation work. Have you already conducted research or evaluation on the program? Or has there never been a systematic evaluation of the character program? Once you've determined your program and evaluation lifecycle phases, the last question you want to ask yourself is whether the phases are aligned. We can illustrate alignment and misalignment with this figure, where we have program lifecycle phases along the horizontal x-axis and evaluation lifecycle phases on the vertical y-axis. If the program and evaluation phases are perfectly aligned, the program would fall somewhere along the red diagonal line, such as Program A, which has a phase 4 dissemination program lifecycle and is conducting a phase 4 generalizability evaluation. Now, while this is the ideal, in reality, program and evaluation life cycles are almost never aligned. And in fact, the only time I've ever encountered perfect alignment is when I've started working with a partner before the program even existed. So we typically have programs that either fall above or below the diagonal red line. And it's really important to consider what this means. So let's look at programs below the red line, such as Program B. These are programs that have evaluations that are lagging behind the program lifecycle phase. So Program B is in the stability phase of its program lifecycle, but it's doing process and response evaluation. So this, for example, is a stable program that's been implemented several times, but they're only looking at things like participant satisfaction. And there's a couple of risks associated with this. It could be a weak program, in which case it should be changed or retired in favor of a different, more effective program. Or it could be a really effective program that should be promoted more widely, but it can't, because it can't make strong enough claims about its effectiveness without evaluation data to back it up. Now let's think about programs that fall above the red line, such as Program C. These are programs that are doing evaluations that are more advanced than their program lifecycle calls for. So Program C is in the initiation program lifecycle phase, but it's being evaluated using a comparison and control evaluation, such as a randomized control design. So what Program C really needs is rapid feedback focused on program implementation. An evaluation of program effectiveness at this point would be premature and runs the risk of making bad programmatic decisions. This could actually be a mediocre program, but when we did our evaluation, Jennifer happened to be the person who was the primary one implementing it, and she's just amazing. And it doesn't really matter what she was doing, we were going to see some kind of impact. But the moment that Jennifer's no longer in charge, the program falls apart. That's one thing that could happen. But the other thing that can happen, which is typically what we see more often, is when we do premature experimentation, we end up getting poor results, and we decide to kill what could have been a highly effective program if it had been given the time to work out the kinks. So what's the primary takeaway from all of this? Misalignment happens, but it's essential to understand the inherent risks and weaknesses when making programmatic decisions on the basis of misaligned evaluations. And it's important to move toward alignment over successive evaluation cycles. So far, I've provided you with some of the underlying premises of what myself and my team think constitutes good program planning and evaluation. We need to work through research practice partnerships and consider the evolutionary life cycle phases of our programs and their corresponding evaluations. Next, I'm going to turn to some of the tools that we've developed to implement relational systems evaluation. The Systems Evaluation Protocol is a guide for conducting relational systems evaluation. And today I'm just going to be focusing on a couple of elements from the modeling stage. The modeling stage includes several steps, including stakeholder analysis. So when thinking about your character program, it's important to consider who your stakeholders are. Different people have different perspectives on the program and can have different and sometimes even competing expectations of the program and of the evaluation of that program. So when designing a program and planning an evaluation, you'll want to consider these various perspectives. Another important step in the systems evaluation protocol is boundary analysis. On the surface, defining the boundaries of your character program might seem really straightforward. However, when you force yourself to be precise, the boundaries may not be so clear. A contributing factor to this complexity is the level of scale. For example, all of the statements posted here are true, but we need to clarify what level of scale we're operating in. In universities, it's common to have nested layers of programming. So let's consider Wake Forest's program for leadership and character as an example. And I apologize for any mistakes in my example. My information is from the website. So there's likely an overarching programmatic design or theory of change that underlies the work of the center that's aimed at promoting character development across the university. This theory of change might be explicit or it might be implicit. Nested within the program for leadership and character are programmatic areas or initiatives such as character courses, college programming, and efforts in the professional schools, among others, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just focusing on these three. Ideally, the programming and initiatives in each of these three areas is aligned with the overarching theory of change for the program for leadership and character. Then nested within each programmatic area are specific projects. For example, character courses offered through various departments, college programming using various delivery mechanisms, such as discussion groups and workshops, and each professional school has their own unique way of addressing character. Each of these programmatic areas has their own theory of change that, again, is hopefully aligned with the theories of change for the levels above it. And then nested within each project are a variety of specific programs. For example, the humanities department offers a course on literature and ethics and another course on medicine and humanities. Multiple workshops are offered, including virtues, values, and vocation, as well as leading with authenticity. And the medical school has a narrative medicine cohort and provides professionalism pedagogy coaching. Each of these also has their own, again, implicit or explicit theory of change. An evaluation can occur at any of these levels, and evaluations can occur at multiple levels simultaneously. Once again, alignment, in this case across levels, is key. Each of your organizations are complex systems made up of multiple moving parts. Which level you sit in impacts your needs in terms of programming and evaluation. Some of you may be situated within the overarching university level and have responsibility for character programming across your entire institution. If this is the case, your needs in terms of programming and desired results are going to be at a more global level. You're more likely to be interested in long-term, longitudinal, and cumulative outcomes across multiple program efforts. Others of you might be situated in one of these nested levels. Those of you who have more direct contact with participants operate at a more local level of the system and are likely much more interested in shorter-term outcomes that directly reflect the results of your interactions with participants. So when designing your character initiative and its evaluation, it's critical to consider variations in stakeholder needs and priorities and how these might differ based on where stakeholders are situated within the broader system. When this is not done, a common refrain that I end up hearing from people who are sitting at more global levels of the system, such as funders or organizational leadership, is why can't the practitioners just give me the data I'm asking for? Why is it so difficult to get what we need? And then from those who sit at the more local level, I often hear things like, why are the funders and leaders asking me for these ridiculous metrics that have nothing to do with my work? So in order to get high quality, useful evaluation results, you need to make sure that the evaluation you design addresses the needs of stakeholders at multiple levels of the system. As you're designing and describing your character initiative, be sure to consider what level of the system you're designing for, and make sure your evaluation and measurement strategy addresses multiple stakeholder priorities simultaneously. And in order to do any of the things I've described thus far, you will need to have a well-articulated, explicit programmatic theory of change that describes how you think the activities participants experience lead to the character outcomes you anticipate. A common request I get is also, can't you just give me the measure? However, before we can talk about measures, we have to know what it is we want to measure and why. All good programs and program evaluations start by investing time up front in developing a detailed theory of change. Some of you might already have a visual theory of change or a logic model for one or more of your programs. Most logic models use a columnar format depicting a group of activities or inputs that lead to a group of short-term outcomes and then onto a group of longer-term outcomes. This logic model format leaves out a lot of critical information, and they're prone to leaps of logic that, when critically examined, don't really make sense. So I prefer using what we call a pathway model, which provides a more detailed depiction of the programmatic theory of change. Consistent with the principles of relational systems evaluation, pathway models are often developed through a facilitated process that we describe in the systems evaluation protocol that includes researchers and those with programmatic expertise. Pathway models provide a detailed depiction of the relationship between specific program activities, which are in the yellow boxes, and the resulting short-term, pink boxes, medium-term, blue boxes, and long-term outcomes, green boxes. The arrows connecting the boxes explain how we think the program unfolds and ultimately leads to our desired outcomes. This model was drawn in the Netway, which is a free web-based tool that anybody can access, as is the systems evaluation protocol. Building the model can yield new insights and allow us to develop a shared understanding. In fact, that process of developing the theory of change can be even more valuable than the resulting product. A visual theory of change can be so much more than just a required component of a grant proposal, for example. It can be a tool for explicitly calling out where your program focuses on character building activities and character outcomes. It can also be used to connect your program to the research evidence base. And it can be used to help you refine and narrow your evaluation and measurement approach. I'm going to use a pathway model over the next couple of slides that I developed in partnership with Scouts BSA. So for our national scale study of Scouts BSA, we began by using relational systems evaluation and the systems evaluation protocol to develop two theories of change. One pathway model illustrated adult volunteer development in Scouts BSA, and then the other model, which I have on the screen here, illustrates youth development in Scouts BSA. We developed the models with leaders from the BSA national office as well as local leaders. And then we conducted 23 focus groups with a total of 52 Scouts BSA youth and 77 adult volunteers in 7 states in order to determine whether the model was consistent with participants' lived experiences and understanding of how Scouts BSA works. Once the model was developed, we mined the model to identify things such as hubs. These are nodes that have lots of arrows going into and out of them, key links between the nodes, and stakeholder priorities, which helps us to then identify key through lines. The first key through line that emerged describes youth identity development. The second key through line describes moral, ethical, and character development. And the third key through line describes social and emotional skills development. We can then use the pathway model to help us identify where the program focuses on character building activities and character outcomes. So if we zoom in on the moral, ethical, and character development through line, we see that it begins with the activity of youth reciting the Scout Oath and Law, which leads to the short-term outcomes, apply Scout Oath and Law, which leads to youth and adults have shared values, to increased connection with adults, and behavior increasingly aligned with the Scout Oath and Law. This leads to an ability to articulate one's core values and the ability to make ethical and moral decisions. This leads to greater autonomy, increased growth mindset, which leads to perseverance, resilience, and a greater connection to the community. These then lead to the long-term outcome, increased ethical decision-making, and resolve to live by the values of Scouting. So in addition to highlighting where the program focuses on character, a detailed theory of change can also help us identify where we may have gaps in character development and direct us toward a programmatic strategy. Visual theories of change also help us connect the programmatic theory to the research evidence base. Evidence mapping allows us to identify where there is research that supports or refutes the theory of change. Evidence mapping also helps us refine and narrow the evaluation and measurement approach. It's typically not possible to assess every activity and measure every outcome in a pathway model. Let's take a simple example. By connecting the activity students complete engineering kits with the short-term outcome, increased youth interest in science, we've hypothesized that completing the kits leads to increased interest. Similarly, by connecting the medium-term outcome, increased interest in taking science classes, with the long-term outcome, increased rates of youth majoring in science in college, we are again establishing a causal hypothesis. Same thing when we connect the long-term outcome, increased rates of youth majoring in science in college, with the long-term outcome, increased rates of people entering STEM professions. Next, we can turn to the scientific literature to see if there is evidence for our hypotheses. The goal of this step is to hang or attach evidence to the causal relations that have been articulated in our pathway model. There's already been research done that shows that youth who are more interested in STEM in high school are more likely to major in STEM fields in college. There's also research evidence that shows that youth who major in STEM fields in college are more likely to pursue STEM careers. So in our evaluation, we can focus our efforts on testing whether completing those engineering kits leads to increased interest in science and increased interest in taking science classes. The research evidence can then pick up and complete the causal pathway. This allows us to demonstrate the logical connection to longer-term outcomes that might be more difficult for us to measure. We refer to this as the golden spike. It's the place where our evaluation efforts end and the research literature picks up and takes us to the long-term outcomes. Where did this come from? This name, the Golden Spike, it came from the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, where in Promontory Point, Utah, a golden spike was laid at the point where the western and eastern tracks met. So going back to our pathway model for Scouts BSA, we can see where there was research evidence supporting the moral, ethical, and character development through line. We can also do character framework mapping by identifying where in our programmatic theory of change we are using evidence-based strategies for character development, as well as specific character constructs. A detailed pathway model also helps us formulate evaluation questions and identify which constructs to measure. Again, we can turn to the research evidence base to identify measures, and we can do measurement mapping to visually see our measurement strategy as well as any triangulation. Ultimately, the goal is to have a unified vision for character across multiple levels of your organization. To help achieve this, you can create models for different levels of your system. So you could have a model that describes your university level theory of change for character development. And then the local level programs, for example, courses or college programs in the case of Wake Forest Program for Leadership and Character, can then map their activities and outcomes from their model onto that more global model. And this helps identify where specific local level programs have shared features with the global level theory of change. You can also look at commonalities and differences between programs that sit at the same level in the system. If you have models for programs that share similar goals, you can look across models for common outcomes and activities, varying outcomes and activities, and ways the programs have adapted to their unique contexts. This also helps to indicate opportunities for shared measurement strategies. Once you understand how different levels of your organizational system are working toward achieving character development, you can create a unified evaluation and measurement strategy. So in today's talk, I covered how to use a theory of change to identify your initiative's character-related activities and outcomes, how a visual theory of change can be used to connect research evidence and specific character frameworks to your initiative, and I briefly touched on how this can then be used to help your evaluation and measurement strategy. So I'm very happy to take questions, and I'm also happy to connect after today's talk if anybody wants to reach out to me over email. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I love this is some of my favorite stuff. I love when somebody gives me a window into how their mind works and maps it out and shows me all of the things that are connected to one another and how they sit on their own. I just want to give everybody a chance to, you can go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A anytime, and I'll field them and make sure that they get to Jennifer on your behalf. Just to get us started, we have a range of expertise in the people that come to our webinars. So I'm going to ask this first question, as a person who is coming from a philosopher's background. I don't know anything about how to do the sort of work that you do. Suppose I'm running a program at my school. So first of all, do I need an expert at your level to do this work? What kind of thing can I do if I don't have one of you and can't afford to hire one of you? What's the sort of, take me through those initial stages for somebody who doesn't have this kind of perspective on what we can get done?
Sure, it's a great question. We make all of our materials free and available for anybody to pick up and use. And when I say materials, I mean a lot of materials. We have the Systems Evaluation Guide, which is a facilitator's guide. So you, as somebody who has no background in evaluation, can pick up the facilitator's guide and use it to lead you and your colleagues through an effort at creating a pathway model, a stakeholder map, among other things. We also have in the Netway videos, worksheets, frequently asked questions. So you can really access everything and you can run through it on your own. And we've actually done studies where we've looked at, is that feasible? Are people able to sort of self-teach? And you can. The other thing is within the Netway, you can actually create those models that I had up on the screen, those pathway models. And it's really simple drag and drop kind of modeling. You're not trying to play in PowerPoint and make arrows look pretty. You're just sort of getting your thinking down. So it's definitely something that anybody can do. You don't need to be an expert in evaluation. Most of the time when we're working, doing this kind of work, we're working with practitioners. So folks who are not necessarily even sitting within the academy, who are just trying to find ways to articulate the work that they do and why they're doing it. And so it is something that should be accessible for anybody, even just people who are starting out.
So you're telling me, even though it looks terrifying, it's not actually. When I get into it, I don't need to be overwhelmed by all of these models. If I just go in there, it's step by step. It takes me through it.
Step by step. It's very step by step. And we also often suggest starting with an analog version, get a bunch of index cards out on a table and just brainstorm, okay, what is it that we're doing in our program? That's something, depending on where you sit in the system, sometimes it's easier to think about what is it that I'm doing? What are the activities I'm asking my participants to engage in? And if you sit higher in a system, sometimes it's easier to think about what are those global outcomes, those long-term outcomes I'm trying to achieve. So some people like to work sort of from left to right, activities out to long-term outcomes, and other people prefer to do a more backwards design. Start with your longer term outcomes and sort of work your way backwards. You can articulate those, put one activity, put one outcome on each index card, lay them out on a table, put them up on a wall, and just start playing with them. Move them around. Get out your pencil. Start drawing arrows and connections between.
I think you connected with my speed here. I love now we have index cards and pencils, and I feel myself in the game. I also like, so what you were just saying, you know what, maybe we just stop sharing your screen so
Yes,
people can see you in a
sure, of
bigger way.
course.
It sounds like also based on what you were just saying too, that it's quite flexible. So there's no, here's an exact starting point where you have to begin. You can work from, I mean, maybe this goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, is in order to populate this with real content, we have to know more about the particular program, the particular goals you're working in. Does that sound right to you?
That is right. There's not a specific starting point. You can enter this at any point and you can pick and choose the things that you want to do. So for example, I talked a little bit about stakeholders and really understanding your stakeholder priorities. We have all sorts of worksheets and instructions for small, simple activities that you can do around brainstorming your stakeholders and laying them out in terms of how proximal or distal they are to your effort. And really then thinking through in a sort of guided way, okay, what are the different priorities of these various stakeholder groups? How do I need to think about their needs? And we sort of break it down into little bite-sized pieces. So if that was the thing that you most wanted to focus on, you could go in and you can just look at stakeholder analysis. Or maybe you want something else sounded appealing and you want to start with something else. Or you don't want to use all of the pieces and you just really like that pathway modeling and you just want to do pathway modeling. So it is very flexible. And we also like to think of it as being an iterative process. So we think of pathway models as living, breathing documents. We often get them to a point where we feel like, okay, this is a good enough stopping point. And then we'll print out a really big version of it and put it someplace public where everybody who's working on the program can see it and can reference it. It's a really great way to help center everyone around shared vision. But that then changes. So I collect some evaluation data and oh, I learned something. And now we need to go and revisit that pathway model again. So that's another thing that we'll do is we'll collect some data. We'll look at the model again and say, do we need to change the model? Do we know a little bit more now? And so we need to make some adjustments here and there. So we do really think of it as something that's not static. That's guiding our work collectively as we're working on our programmatic efforts.
Good. We do have some questions about revisions, but I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Let's back up for a second. So you're first designing your theory of change for a particular institution or a particular project or program on a campus. Can you say a little bit more about how you get started developing a theory of change and who does somebody want to be a part of that conversation? Who, there are the stakeholders who want to consider all the different things that people want for us, but who actually comes to the table and we want to consult when we're developing that model?
Great question. So when I mentioned the systems evaluation protocol, which again is that step-by-step guide for how to do all of this stuff, what I focused on was just the modeling stage. I didn't say anything about the preparation stage. And it's in the preparation stage where you really pause and consider who needs to be at the table. And that's a critical question. Who do you want in your working group? You don't want the working group to be so large that it's unwieldy, but you don't want it to be so small that you're missing really critical perspectives. So it is a little bit of a sort of Goldilocks problem, right? You have to find sort of the just right spot. Oftentimes you can't have all of the perspectives in the room that you might want. And there's ways to address that. One is you can do perspective taking activities while you're in the process of developing the model. So you can imagine wearing the hat of a different stakeholder and really try to put yourself in their shoes and think about, okay, if I was in that position, what would I be thinking? The other thing that you can do is you can develop the model with your smaller working group and then take it on the road or in order to validate it. That was what I was describing with the focus groups that we did for the Scouts BSA model. That was a national scale study. We were not going to have people from all across the country in a room together building a pathway model. So we had key stakeholder voices present to build it. And then we literally took the model on the road and we showed it to kids and we showed it to adult leaders. And we said, what did we get right? What did we get wrong? What's consistent with what you experience out in the real world? And then based on the feedback we got, we made changes accordingly.
So how far ahead then are you planning versus where you are? So you mentioned at one point, you showed this graph where, one of the, I think it was the one that was above the line, was doing all these metrics, but they're not ready for that yet. So how do you make sure that what you're doing right now is the place that you should be right now? And how far ahead of yourself do you need to be in understanding where you're going next?
Great question. So you don't necessarily want to overwhelm yourself, right? Like when I think about my doctoral students, it's like, look at what's right here. Let's worry about the things that are going to be 5 years from now, in a few years. When you're, in some ways, it depends where your starting point is. So if, let's say you're in the position where you're developing something new, what you're going to want is really rapid feedback. You're not going to necessarily be doing deep dive analyses. You're going to be trying to collect in the moment helpful, useful information that's going to allow you to make revisions to what you're designing. So an example that I give is when I'm teaching an undergraduate class, let's say, and I'm looking around the room and I notice, okay, a bunch of my students have their heads on their desks and they're clearly not paying attention. I better change something about what I'm doing right now in this class if I want to get their attention again. So I made an observation, I made an evaluative assessment, and then I made a change based on that. And I tried it out and I saw if it worked. I, started doing jumping jacks to see if I could get their attention, right? And then if it doesn't work, I try something else. Now, that's an example of a sort of, kind of evaluative thing that we all do just going through life. You can do things that are quick, but systematic and intentional when you're in those early stages of developing a program. So for example, with our ECI project, we're going to be developing a virtual reality infused character course. We're developing something new. It doesn't exist yet. We are planning on, first of all, starting by building our pathway model. And we're going to build 3 of them. We're going to build, actually we're building more than 3. We're going to build an overarching model for sort of this course writ large. What is it that we're hoping to achieve? And then for each module in our course will have its own pathway model. As we work on developing each of the materials for the modules, we're going to be doing that really rapid process evaluation work. We design a component of a VR experience. We bring in 10 students. We have them try it out. We have them tell us what worked well, what didn't work well, test whether we're seeing some early indications of some outcomes potentially, but we're doing it in a very rapid, small scale way so that we're getting feedback to make refinements to the program. It's not until your program gets to a more steady state where you have some consistency in how it's being delivered and you have comfort in what you've put together that you really want to start thinking about doing that more systematic, longer term, slightly more intensive kind of evaluative work.
Okay, so when you're looking at, so we have some questions about how you know when to change things up. And it sounds like based on what you're saying, that information is mostly coming from the smaller moments. When we're looking at this like enormous multi-pronged projects have been put into one pathway, you're not looking at that and seeing something that tells you need to move things around. Is that right?
Right. And also keep in mind, you're not necessarily evaluating every aspect of your pathway model.
Right.
Right. So what I didn't share is how do you get from that pathway model down to your evaluation scope? So when I say scope, what I mean is for the upcoming evaluation cycle, what part of my model will I focus on? You're not going to try and do everything all in one. You're going to decide where you want to focus your evaluative efforts. And remember when I mentioned that lightning bolt test, that shift from a phase 2 to a phase 3, that's that one that I think you're describing. Like, how do I know when I need to really change gears? That's why we described that lightning bolt test, that idea that you have, like, how do I know? I know because my program is fully protocolized. There's some clear curriculum. It doesn't live within just the people who developed it. I can hand it off to somebody else. That's how you know it's stable enough that you're ready to do something like an RCT or something that has a more intensive design behind it.
Okay, great. Can you talk us through a little bit? I think it was really interesting, and I know this is probably just asking you to repeat yourself a little bit, but maybe fill in because this part went by quickly for me. how do you identify the through lines again? So that was so interesting. It's like you've got this big thing where everything looks connected to everything else, but then there are these pathways that emerge where there are sort of either it seems like sometimes questions animate the through line or sometimes dense relationships. And then something about this overall picture is going to help us identify points where we want to go in and do a targeted evaluation. Can you just talk through that a little bit?
Sure. And again, this is all in the systems evaluation protocol. So I promise you what I'm telling you, if anybody tries to write this down frantically, it's all available to you.
I feel like you're telling me I just need to go do the homework. Like, you don't
No,
need to
no,
ask me questions. Can you just read the syllabus
I
and
just
then you'll be fine?
I don't want anybody to feel nervous, like, oh, I missed that part. I promise that you didn't miss it, you can get it still. So I did go through that fairly quickly, but I'll describe it a little bit more. So once we have that model done, and sometimes it does look like a bowl of spaghetti, by the way, we sometimes refer to it as a big bowl of spaghetti. We ask questions of the model that sort of help us to go from this like massive, I'm, maybe in looking at this from a bird's eye, seeing the forest kind of view, to really getting a little bit into the weeds by asking really targeted questions. So we start by saying, okay, when I visually look at this model, and I usually print it out on a piece of paper, big piece of paper, which of the boxes have lots of arrows going into them and out of them? And we literally start just by counting. How many arrows are going in? How many? And then we use stickers when we're doing it, when we're doing our crafty version. We put stickers on the nodes that have the most arrows in and out of them. And we say, great, okay, good, done. Now, we're going to just look at each connection between any two boxes. Just examine connections between two boxes at a time. And where are there really critical connections? Like, where is there something that's connected where you feel like, oh, if that connection doesn't happen, we have a problem. And we put those little key stickers. Those are our key links. And then we say, okay, now let's think about our stakeholders. And we start with our first stakeholder, let's say our funder. Which of these nodes does our funder really care about? Which nodes do they need us to report on? And we put stickers identifying those nodes. And we do that for maybe 3, maybe 4 stakeholders. Then we say, great, we were just in the weeds. Now let's step back and let's look at what we've just created. Let's look at the stickers. And what ends up happening is those through lines emerge. You are not deliberately trying to create them. You literally are able to follow the stickers from nodes through lines and all the way out. And all we're looking for is how do we connect the dots from an activity out to a long-term outcome. So that's sort of the beauty of it, is that you're doing it in these piecemeal ways that allow you to think about things that are not going to overwhelm your brain, but you inevitably what emerges is the simplicity and the complexity.
I love that. That was really helpful. Good. We still have questions coming in, so I'm just going to keep firing them at you, and I promise I'll wrap us up on time. But okay, so for the researchers in the room, people that are interested in the connection between the kind of work that you're doing when you're tracking the program and how you would translate this into research projects. So are there any clear ways that you would think about how the model sort of points towards, or where you would look to translate that model into research projects? So what's this kind of the relationship between that and an analytical model of another kind?
I love that question too, because one of the things that we often talk about is that depending on sort of your role, you are going to likely use and look at the models differently. So if I'm a researcher, one of the things that's super helpful is that if I'm able to look at a model and I can say, I know where there's research evidence supporting these components, and I maybe am helping with doing some of that evidence mapping, but I also know where there's gaps. And where there's gaps, that's a research project. And it's researchers who have more ability to really test out some of those medium to long-term connections that are a lot harder to do if your focus is programmatic, right? Because sometimes that means you need to do a longitudinal study. Well, a lot of programs don't have the ability to, follow their participants for years and years and years and years and see what happens. But researchers can look at questions related to, does increasing humility lead to better ethical decision making? And we can do more basic research studies to understand what those connections are and whether they in fact do exist. So I see that, in other words, as the model. Again, if you think about each one being its own hypothesis, it lets you see where there's gaps in the research.
Okay, so this one is coming then on the, like, let's go from the most abstract researcher question to the, like, let's really connect with the students. How optimistic are you that a well-designed program can genuinely affect the character of students, and that we can track and measure that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. That's why I'm really excited about our project, to be totally honest with you, because it is really hard, first of all, to move the needle on some of the things that we're interested in, and our approaches and measurement strategies are not perfect and often rely a lot on things like self-report. So to answer those are sort of two separate questions. One is really about, like, do we think we can affect change in university students? I really genuinely think we can. And part of what motivated me to put together the project that we put together at Montclair was experiencing virtual reality and what it's like to truly embody somebody else and to experience the world through somebody else's eyes. And there's a lot of research that isn't about character. Like, think about, where do we see virtual reality mostly? It's, if you've ever experienced it, it's a lot of like shoot 'em up games and a lot of, let's say, like, not the most pro-social uses of virtual reality. But we haven't fully explored what we can do with it and what some of the power is behind these innovative technologies. And I really do genuinely believe that there's opportunities for us to really move the needle on character outcomes for our university students when we do very thoughtful programming and involve our students in designing that programming. That's really critical. And then on the measurement side, we have to be creative. And I also do a lot of work internationally. And one of the things that we struggle with a lot is that the way that we define our character constructs from a Western perspective is not necessarily the same as it's defined in other non-Western perspectives. And I'll take that a step further and say, we also haven't done a lot to think about, even within the United States, for example, cross-cultural understanding of character and how character might be defined differently and therefore needs to be measured differently for various student populations. So I think part of what we need to do is to really make sure that what we're measuring is what is important to the students that we're trying to impact, and that we're thinking creatively about how we can do that. Some of my favorite measurement approaches are really taking opportunities by observing artifacts of the work that we do. So, is there some sort of outcome that's a tangible byproduct of people participating in your program, and can that be used as a measure? So let's say you have a course and you have your students doing reflective journaling in that course. Are you able to look at the reflective journaling and qualitatively analyze it to see whether there's shifts in how the students are talking about various character virtues, for example? So I think it does require us to think creatively and think outside the box and not just rely solely on self-report survey measures.
Do you think the model that we've been talking about today can capture some of those differences in student population? So if we figure out how to adjust which things we're putting on our note cards and where we put the stickers, is the flexibility of this model able to capture things like, or to welcome everyone to the table to sort of think about and measure character in their own way?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so sometimes what we've done is we'll have versions of a model. Like, we might have sort of the everybody looking at this together, sort of what are these sort of core components that we all agree on, and then having separate subgroups potentially saying, okay, but in this context or with this population, it's going to look a little bit different. And that's where you're starting to get into questions around adaptation. And what you're really starting to ask when you're asking about adaptation is, what are my core elements, my core ingredients in my programming? And what are the components that need to be adapted in order for my effort to be effective. Because if I don't adapt them, it's not appropriate for the population or the context I'm working in.
Amazing. I think I'm going to wrap us up here. This is a good place for us to end. Jen, I don't know if you want to put your contact slide back up again so that people know how to reach you. And I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming and being part of this session. And thank you so much to Jennifer Urban for being here today and talking us through this. You're wonderful. And anyone who's coming to our conference in December, she's going to be there presenting a session on assessment and measurement as well, and you'll get a chance to meet her and ask her questions in purpose.
And practice doing pathway modeling. We'll actually be getting our hands dirty in that session, so join us.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you.